Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chris Wood, Director of the Santa Fe Institute's Business Network, and I'm really glad to be here this morning to be able to welcome you to this year's annual Trustee and Business Network Symposium. Now, that's really an understatement. I'm really, really glad to be here this morning to be able to welcome you. We've got one really jam-packed, interesting, innovative symposium for you this year. Thanks to the organizers, SFI President David Krakauer, Board Chair Emeritus Bill Miller, and current Board Chair Michael Mobison, this is going to be, as they say in the vernacular, a kick-ass program. We have a number of innovations in the structure and organization of the program this year, a couple of which I'd like to mention because they will apply throughout the entire program. First, we've allocated substantial amounts of time for discussion and Q&A. The talk slots are an hour and a half in length, half of which will be devoted to time for the speaker. After that, the other half will be devoted to Q&A and discussion in a couple of different ways. The first 10 to 15 minutes after the speaker finishes, there will be a short time for questions for clarification only, not for discussion. But immediately after that, each of your tables will engage in a roundtable discussion amongst yourselves before we will open it up for general Q&A, which will be led by David Krakauer after each talk. The goal is to try to engage each of you to think deeply and broadly about the issues raised by each speaker, to share those thoughts with your table, and then to bring that to the entire group during the general Q&A. You've each self-organized into a set of tables this morning. We will be switching those at the beginning of each session. That is, stay where you are for the entire morning session. Then this afternoon, we'll ask you to switch tables, and don't take your cronies with you. The idea is to mix up so that we have an interesting mix across the entire 2 days. You will also notice microphones on each of your tables. That's designed to facilitate each of you asking questions of the speaker and or adding to the discussion. The AV tech will control those mics. They're on. Just wait to be pick one up, wait to be called on by David, and then hold the mic close so that we can all be able to be sure to hear you. Finally, on each of your tables, you'll notice there is an individual representation of currency. There are a couple of leaflet descriptions of each of those currencies around the tables, and I think you'll find it very interesting, the wide range and form of currencies you have represented. So be sure and read those at your leisure. With that introduction, I'd now like to introduce SFI President David Krakauer, who will kick off the meeting substantively. David?
All right. Good morning. People have been asking, why do you have a conference on money? Why are you starting on money? And I'll try and explain. But the real reason is very simple, and that is that one of the primary responsibilities of a president is to fundraise. But sometimes it's awkward just to talk about money and ask for money. So what I do is surround you with it and hope that you eventually get the hint, for those of you who have an interest in supporting SFI. And the money in this case you can eat. The first point to make, obviously, on this topic is it's hard to escape from it. I mean, you can't pick up The Economist or a magazine or a newspaper without reading at least one article about Bitcoin or blockchain. There's something in the air in relation to currency. And we felt it was important that SFI played a role in establishing some of the principles for 21st century money and currencies. And, you know, it's interesting that if you were to ask somebody to list topics that are of interest to the Santa Fe Institute, they may come up with a list something like this, and here's just some examples. Simple rules that produce complex behavior, that would be one. Reward and incentives for large-scale cooperation. The regulators of flow and flow of matter and energy. Strategies for communication and sharing of information. Distributed means of reaching consensus and decisions. System robustness and system collapse. Networks of exchange. Security, error correction, and crypto systems, or the origins of economic inequality. And those are all absolutely key issues for complex systems, but they're all also about money and currency. And so the topic of money serves as what a natural scientist might call a model system. And so when we made progress in quantum mechanics, we made progress by picking a model system, the hydrogen atom, that was tractable, was small enough to be understood, but it generalized up to other elements in the periodic table. But you wouldn't have started with carbon. You would have made very little progress. And geneticists pick fruit flies, Drosophila melanogaster. They don't pick giraffes. You can't study a giraffe in a lab. But the hope is that the fruit fly generalizes the insights to other systems you care about. And for us, in that sense, money and currencies offer an extraordinary laboratory for studying the fundamental principles of complex systems. The other issue, of course, is not just that it's a model system, but it represents in the microcosm mechanisms that we see unfolding everywhere in the universe. And I want to make this very clear to you that for us it's not just about the economy, it's about complex systems in general. The basic belief is that the universe started in a state of compact order, and over the course of many, many years, entropy increases, disorder increases, randomness, chaos. And there are little pockets of order that we see. Planets, solar systems, life on those planets. And in Santa Fe, intelligent life. And the fundamental principles that allow for complexity to emerge is the connection between information on the one hand and matter and energy on the other. And so if you think about this, you can think about information in terms of, for example, fiat currencies. That is, monies and currencies that don't necessarily have intrinsic value, but they reduce the uncertainty of exchange, versus commodity money, matter and energy, that does have intrinsic value. And as you seek to increase the complexity of the system, you want to shift from a system that's largely driven by the constraints of matter and energy, commodity money, to a system that's largely coordinated by information, fiat money. And if you do that, all sorts of interesting questions arise, including, you know, how do you stabilize such a system? What are the fundamental principles of operation? How do you prevent it from running away? How do you prevent it from collapsing? And those are the ideas that we should be, I hope, discussing at this meeting. Now, a little bit of history. Why are we doing this particular meeting? And the reason comes down to a car drive that Jessica Flack and I and Bill Miller took in Baltimore. We were driving, I don't know if you remember this, Bill, but we were driving in your car, and I thought, you know, this seems like a very interesting topic. The topic of money and currencies, and it's something that Bill knows a little thing about. And what do you think about cryptocurrencies? What do you think about Bitcoin? And as you know, in this world, there are value investors, and Bill is one of them, and I expected him to say it's a fad. Forget it. Bunch of quants running around getting carried away with tech and apps and software. But he said the absolute opposite. He said he thinks it's one of the most interesting things that's been happening in the economy. It's going to challenge the institutions of finance as we know them. And it plays into the strengths of the Santa Fe Institute. A shift from, in some sense, a centralized, coordinated system of control and exchange to a highly distributed peer-to-peer system. And so why isn't the Santa Fe Institute working on the fundamental principles of peer-to-peer systems? And so this meeting represents our first foray into that, and hopefully you'll see real science coming out of this meeting in trying to understand the mathematics and dynamics of money in the 21st century. So with that, I will pass it over to the first speaker.
So our first speaker this morning is Jordan Greenhall. Jordan is an entrepreneur and angel investor whose goal is to be as disruptive as possible in the tech space. Jordan?
All right, so David did the handoff perfectly, which is to say that I came in wanting to take this notion of a transdisciplinary look at currency seriously. But first, a quick caveat. Given my background, I am not a scientist and I'm not a scholar, which means I can make no claim to rigor or to erudition. Instead, I am in fact a high-tech entrepreneur, so I can guarantee that I can be provocative, hopefully evocative. There might be a little bit of truth, and if we're lucky, it might actually be useful. So, we talk about the concept of currency, and generally speaking, it is used roughly to mean something like money that we use now. It's actually a very poorly defined concept, and it's used interchangeably, it's thrown around, but also, in my world in particular, we use it to describe all kinds of different kinds of phenomena. Social currency and reputation currency are things that are talked about and bandied about by marketing folks willy-nilly. But even at dinner last night, I actually heard the word currency used 4 different times in 4 different ways, all of which actually seem to make sense. Right? So it could be, it's just a bad use of language, we're not defining our terms well, but it could be that there actually is something actually transdisciplinary, which I mean to say actually mechanism independent, that is important going on here. And David pointed, I think, straight at the middle of it. That is the sort of thing that we can usefully actually do work on at a place like SFI. Now, in order to do a job on that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take on myself all the risk and strip away the concepts from any existing terminology that's out there. Right? So first I'm going to create a little bit of a toy model of the object that I want to work with. Now obviously this is a terrible toy model, but it gets the job done for the purposes of this presentation. And it may very well map to better ideas like complex adaptive systems and whatnot. And if so, please just tell me that on the side. The basic idea is here you have some sort of agent in a system that has the capacity to input information or energy from its environment, a capacity to process that, identify patterns, and then use that process to deliver on some selection of activities and outputs back into the environment. This is all I'm talking about when I use the word sense-making agent. And each of these different phases are subject to bandwidth constraints, meaning that, for example, a camera can't hear, or that a fruit fly has a limited amount of processing capacity from the things that it can input from its environment. Now, signal is the second object in the toy model. Right? We have information with some kind of intrinsic pattern. We have a signal in the environment. And when signal is intercepted by a sense-making agent, and it generates sense, which is to say that it changes the state of the sense-making agent's behaviors in the environment, I'm going to call that significance. All right? So now we're in a state where sense has been made in the environment. And then finally, when significance encounters some capacity for feed forward or feedback in the relationship between the sense-making agent and the signal, we're now finally in the domain of what I'm going to define as currency. All right? So to put it slightly differently, a currency is a signal that facilitates the coherent coordination of 2 or more sense-making agents. I'm going to spend a little bit of time drilling down on that. And then I'm going to use this definition to cover a very large amount of ground very poorly. There's actually a lot of meat on this bone, and I really look forward to the rest of the program chewing on different aspects of it. So here's some examples of things that are in this definition. Right? Classic Stigmergy is clearly a currency as defined, as are various flavors of language, both relatively simple and more complex. And then finally, as a special case, money. Right? So when I think about currency, I like to think about the currency and money as different things, and money being a kind of currency. Notably, within the currency landscape is this really interesting notion of the capacity to couple otherwise heterogeneous agents into a new kind of co-evolving object, which I'm going to call convivium. So here we have a flower and a bee, and the flower emits a signal that in fact makes sense for the bee, and the bee can feed back on the flower, and this feedback then generates a new agent on the system, which is a convivium. And that's a very interesting ontological object, because obviously once you have these, depending on the tightness of their coupling and the capacity of their coupling to then act back on the environment, you'd start building up a substrate of convivia on top of convivia. Now, what is not a currency? There's a number of very interesting examples that are not currencies. And in fact, you can think about the adjective of the notion that something may lose currency, like an idea can have currency, an idea can lose currency. Right? So to have currency speaks to the degree to which a signal makes sense and then leads to a tighter or lesser coupling in this generation of convivia. So on the one hand, for example, in the picture of the monkey, we have signals that are currency for certain agents and not currency for other agents. We have the possibility of signals that don't generate meaningful capacities for feedback, right? So they're just simply signals with significance but without feedback. And then we also have the interesting case of currencies that once did a reasonable job of actually conveying sense and driving coherence, which for one reason or another have actually reduced their capacity to deliver that coherence and are now no longer currencies in a meaningful sense. Now, going back to our model of the sense-making agent, this notion of bandwidth constraints turns out to be very important, right? Because if you modulate the different kinds of bandwidth constraints, you modulate the different kinds of currencies that an agent can have access to and use meaningfully in the environment. And it can explore currency space in very different ways. Right? So one example is the evolution of the brain, which expands both the portfolio of currencies, the kinds of currencies that are available in the processing element, and also the complexity of currencies that can be dealt with. So, for example, we can think about a vertical increase in currency space. This is an in-depth increase that the peahen can extract more signal from that than you can. Or horizontal, right, with the coupling of different kinds of signaling modalities into a more complex currency portfolio, which gives rise to different sorts of couplings and different sorts of behaviors. And since these convivia begin to have feedbacks on their own environment, you start seeing a very interesting exchange between the currency portfolios, the kinds of signaling modalities and the signal bandwidths, and the kinds of convivia that emerge and how they actually evolve through time. So, for example, to drill down, let's take a look at human beings as sense makers. And I'm actually going to refer to human beings as the Dunbar sense maker. Again, remember, lack of rigor and lack of erudition. I'm probably just destroying this concept. But the basic idea, as I understand it, is that human beings have some soft limit in our ability to maintain high-quality social relationships at about 150. And so what I would say is what this represents is the maximum bandwidth capacity of human beings to effectively use the set of currencies that are associated with our level of convivia, our level of organization, before it gets tapped out. Right? So as you expand the number of human beings in the band past a certain level, we just don't have the bandwidth capacity to operate with that, and that generates various forms of failure conditions. And this is a very complex currency. Right? We're dealing with a number of different high bandwidth, very nuanced feedbacks around body language and facial expression and various kinds of tonality and position in space, all of which is meaningless, right, for a cat or a bug, but is able to be received by this particular kind of sense maker to make sense and then generate a highly effective convivium. Now, of course, one of the very interesting things about humans is that we seem to have the ability to actually feedback very effectively on our environment and take some ownership over not only our bandwidth capacities, but also our currency systems. Right? Now, in prehistory, we see the emergence of different kinds of material culture that expand the bandwidth capacity of our local sense maker and then create an enormous exploration of new kinds of currency space. Right? So, for example, the emergence of arts and language opens up an entirely new domain, a huge niche of currency space that we're still in the process of exploring. And on the bottom right corner, the invention of accounting, right, which we're going to now use as our next case in point, because accounting is in fact what leads us to our modern idea of money. And to tell that story, I'm going to steal wholesale from David Graeber's excellent book, Debt, which I cannot vouchsafe is in fact actually true. So, if it turns out this is completely wrong, ignore the details and just focus on the architecture, because I think the architecture is quite nice. The story that he tells is that the narrative that the economists talk about of the movement from the barter economy to the invention of money is simply a myth. It's not historically accurate. That's not how it happened. Instead, the emergence of modern money was, in fact, initially enmeshed in social currency. Human beings had highly complex personal relationships managed by the Dunbar sensemaker, largely stored in memory. And over time, as we began to invent new forms of material culture to explore our currency, the currency space, we began to externalize some of these social currencies into different kinds of artifacts, which then dramatically changed our bandwidth capacity, which then dramatically changed the kinds of convivia that we could operate in. On the left, we have a very important innovation, which is the ledger, which Graeber identifies as being the real origin of money, the ability to record debts, not in the deeply contextual social relationship level, but at a couple of levels of abstraction. Right? So we simplify the idea, and now I can owe a debt to Jim, and Jim can owe a debt to Peter. I, in fact, owe a debt to Peter, so I owe a debt to Peter. Peter owes a debt to Jim, and we can perhaps make that happen externally on the ledger and not have to deal with it at a purely social level. Notice, by the way, that the Bitcoin blockchain is a digital ledger that operates as a token. We'll talk about that probably in great detail during this environment. And the right-hand side is another element from prehistory, which is the tally stick, which was another really interesting example of the ability to use material culture to externalize social currencies. In this case, you and I mark down the debt on the tally stick, the stock, we break it in half, and now I hold one half, I'm the debtor, you hold the other half, you're the creditor, and when I settle my debt, we combine them. That vouches for the fact that it was the appropriate debt, and then we destroy it. Now, of course, once that happens, you have an externalizable token that can then be exchanged. In fact, this was a fundamental form of money up until, what, the late 1800s? I mean, it's astounding how long that particular tool lived inside humanity. So one of the big moves from social currency to money was this concept of decontextualization and tokenization. And some force, am I still on? In the fitness landscape, pushed a movement away from social into ledgers and finally into tokens. And it was a gradual evolution of a very long period of time. Initially, we had relatively gross transactions between city-states for settling of broad accounts, but almost all of the accounting was actually still done on a ledger held in the central location. Right? And eventually, of course, this moved through ingots into coinage and into dollars. And it appears that the primary driver for that evolution was scale. Right? In this case, 3 different dimensions of scale. One dimension was increasing population density, increasing overall population. So the Dunbar sensemaker is tapped out. It can't handle it. And in fact, the ledger finally gets tapped out. There's only so many transactions that can be handled back at home base in Ur. The second is geographic scale. Right? If you're trying to engage in various kinds of transactions 1,000 miles away from home base, having everything backhauled back to the ledger is hard to do. And the final is something that Eric actually explored tremendously, the massive expansion in the kinds of transactions that were occurring. Right? An increasing proliferation, an increasing need to be able to map a currency system that could handle relatively abstract transactions that could no longer be related at all to a deep social context. So then it seems like we may actually be working with 3 variables that relate to each other. One is the underlying complexity of your signaling system, right? The kind of currency modality that you have and the complexity that it requires and the complexity that it can carry. The bandwidth capacity of your sense-making agents, and the scale that you need to deal with. And the scale could be in terms of number of transactions or a space that it needs to cross over. But if you want to increase scale and you're stuck with a relatively fixed bandwidth, then you have to reduce complexity. You have to find new ways to simplify. Right? So this may be a part of the explanation for why modern currency emerged from old school ledgers. Right? Simplify it to grow, complexify to profit. Now, notably, of course, this is in fact a bidirectional move. Right? There are reasons on the fitness landscape for why you would in fact add complexity. So you go from social currency to ledgers to money using techniques, compression, normalization, fungibility, which leads to scalability. But then once money hits the landscape and creates an entirely new set of dynamics, you then see the emergence of recomplexification, right? From simple money to relatively complex, multiple different monetary systems to complex financial instruments and the economy. And in part and parcel of this latter movement was the emergence of the sense-making agent, the firm, right? Which actually has dramatically higher bandwidth capacities than individuals or small partnerships, and that relates very closely to its ability to inject complexity back into the environment for presumably fitness-enhancing reasons. Right? So there are a lot of different interesting considerations. I thought of two just listening to David talk. But here are three that I want to drill down on briefly. One is the concept of trust. Right? So trust is a very interesting notion in these elements of currency. In just the simple case of ledger to money, in social currencies, in some sense, trust is the currency. Right? You know who to trust based upon the social relationships you have, and the social relationships you have modulate the trust that you have. As you externalize that onto the ledger, the trust actually moves to the institution that maintains the ledger, with profound implications for social organization. You begin to have to trust the institution, in this case, trust the priesthood who manage that particular ledger. As you move trust further and further out to the edge, then again, profound implications, right? If you move trust finally to the token itself, or in the Bitcoin case, a trustless environment, right? This is a very interesting set of questions, and what does that imply for what kind of convivia take maximum advantage of these different kind of trust environments? And in fact, the second consideration is a problem that arises when we separate the sense-making function, right, the signification, from the sign. Right? So I'm able to use some kind of sign to generate sense-making, but it's possible to mistake the sign for the sense-making itself. And if I do that, it's a fetish. And what can end up happening is I begin to optimize for the sign, not optimizing for the underlying sense-making that actually drives the coherence of the convivium. So in the present example on the left, we have the possibility, which I would suggest is in fact reasonably close to the truth, that we moderns optimize for GDP at the expense of whatever it is that actually makes us want to stick together and work together. You like the guy on the bottom right? That's not real, by the way. That's actually, although it's getting close to real. In a related area is the notion of signal jacking, or I think a better term, a better way of understanding the idea of debasement. If I can take the signal and I can actually modify the signal and get the value out of the signal without actually transacting whatever the original sense-making was, then I again am disrupting the coherence that maintains this convivium. Right? Now, this can take place in the simple form of theft. Right? It's easy to steal gold. It's hard to steal a ledger. Right? So different kinds of currency regimes have different affordances for different modalities of debasement. It can obviously take place in the classic form of the debasement of a currency. And it's interesting to think about now what that means. To debase a currency is to, in fact, render a signal to have less currency. Right? It has less capacity to do the thing that it has done to maintain the coherence of the convivium. And when it goes past a critical threshold, one would imagine a decoherence of that convivium and some new relationships. And then on the bottom left, right, we talked about the fact that the emergence of language gave rise to an enormous and still not at all completely tapped signal capacity. But if we don't actually take care of mapping the use of the sign with the coherence that it generates, we are in fact debasing that signal and leading to some profoundly negative consequences for the convivia that rely on that currency to mediate their relationships. All right, so then let's move to the current state. We obviously now live in an environment that is experiencing some of the largest proliferations of bandwidth capacities and currencies that we've ever seen. And each one of these are different kinds of examples of what happens when you begin to discover some new bandwidth capacity or begin to identify some new currency that's available and then see what kind of convivia emerge around that. So just to take, for example, Yelp on the bottom right, the ability to externalize my personal sentimental relationship within a restaurant experience, to render some degree of trust in a person who I don't know by being able to have an architecture that generates feedback loops that provide that, and then be able to act on that generates a new convivium. So Yelp is in fact a convivium that coheres around the reputation currencies that are built into the combination of reviews and ratings and metrics like elite and things like that that enable us to all make sense together. And it is in fact a very powerful agent in its fitness landscape. And if you actually look at the data, the restaurant distribution kind, which restaurants are successful, changed significantly as the number of Yelp users in the local region increases. Which is to say that once a critical mass of your customers use Yelp, if you have a poor review, you're out of business. So to drill down on one specific example, a major phenomenon that's happening in our local economy, our current economy, is a movement from hierarchical to horizontal convivia, a new modality of organization that is enabled by the kind of bandwidth capacities that information technology provides. And I'm going to use Uber as a case study. So I assume literally everybody here is familiar with Uber, which speaks volumes. But the basic idea is that you have an app, you tell Uber I'd like a ride. It has a cluster of relatively loosely connected drivers who have signed a very simple contract, possibly to their detriment, and are attached through an information infrastructure. Right? They have an app on their end. What Uber does not do is Uber does not call a driver and say, okay, drive this person. Instead, what they do is they send out a broad signal to a large cluster, a whole swarm of different drivers, mediated by a reputation score. And they assign each driver a reputation score on, by the way, a case-by-case basis. This reputation is generated algorithmically. It includes the actual legacy reputation in terms of the quality of service the driver is given, how often the driver is actually delivered on getting to you in the time frame that Uber thought they ought to, and how quickly they get you to where they're supposed to get you, but also where they're physically located in space. Does it seem like it's going to take them a long time to get to you, or are they relatively scarce in a place where Uber expects a lot more business to come from? So it's a very complex algorithm that delivers to them a reputation score, and then that then affords the driver an opportunity, or not, to access the bid. Right? And then finally, time. Uber issues out the bid. In this case, our driver with a score of 95 hit the bid before the driver with 100. It's a high enough score to get it in that time frame. They get the ride. Right? And that's who ultimately takes you to your destination. Then to close the loop, obviously, we also have experienced the transfer of money, but more importantly, for the maintenance of the coherence of this system is the proliferation of reputation. Uber issues everybody in this environment a whole passel of different reputation currencies, including every individual user, although there's speculation that their reputation currencies for users are still pretty hard-worn. If you can check yours out, see what kind of reputation they give you. The average is 4.9, and in fact, the mean is 4.9, and the minimum is also 4.9, and the maximum is 4.9. So I suspect it's not actually accurate, but it's there, and they can use it. So what we can say is that Uber now is the emergence of some new kind of convivium that operates very differently, obviously, than classic taxi companies, very different relationships, and a dramatically more effective competitive position in the marketplace, which we've all witnessed. But it's only really one step in what appears to be a broader movement. And something that's going on right now, in specifically Uber's circumstance, but more broadly in the economy, is the effort to decentralize even more aggressively, to replace Uber as a still legacy element of a hierarchical centralized element in an otherwise highly decentralized convivium with the blockchain. And this is a really cool thing called a decentralized autonomous organization. I'm not going to go into detail on these, which I'd love to. It's worth an entire set of presentations on its own. But the basic idea is that there is a belief that we can use a number of new currencies, crypto tokens, smart contracts, and a whole proliferation of reputation currencies to generate a whole new form of human organization that people here know a whole lot about, but we haven't actually been able to implement very effectively out in the world, which is a fully decentralized organization that human beings are able to coordinate and create highly complex value without any command and control infrastructure whatsoever. Right? That's the promise. And it's not just a pure notion. There are now 50 companies attempting to build them right now across every possible domain. So that's provocative enough, but I figured I'd double down. The last piece is going all the way to the top, and the problem of collective intelligence and us as a convivium in general, right, humanity. And obviously, over the past 30 or so years, we've experienced a gigantic increase in some portion of our bandwidth capacity, right? But it's not symmetrical. We actually have a lot more coming in now than our Dunbar SenseMaker can possibly handle. And that creates a very interesting problem in the current environment, right? Overwhelm. You have how many different signals are now begging for your attention, and this actually leads to an interesting debasement of the quality of the total signal that will be available from the info space that's happening. Right? I guarantee you right now that there are 6 conversations with the people who are in this room that you should be having that you won't have because we can't actually make sense of the signals that are in the environment. However, one can imagine issuing every individual their own personal Watson, right, that does have the input bandwidth and processing bandwidth capacity to grab all of that signal and turn it from noise into significance and to actually generate a whole new convivium, right? A coupling of the human Watson convivium that becomes an entirely new agent in the fitness landscape, and one might hypothesize, a very powerful agent that would be significant in changing how we human beings operate and represent an entirely new stage in the previous narrative. That's all.
I just want to remind folks how we're doing this. We'll have a bunch of questions. Feel free, and that can go on as long as you like. And when that lags a little bit, turn around to the folks on your table and engage in disputation. And you all have a name, all tables have a name. You're named after your currency, and at the end we'll call on tables to see whether the tables have generated any interesting conversations in their new form as convivia. Okay, Jordan, why don't you just field the first few questions?
Any questions?
It seems that the idea in the Uber example that you could generalize is that the feedback loop of being rated in both directions allows you to generalize the trust that you would have in that Dunbar example where you can trust, and that therefore obviates the need for the token or the ledger, because you're back to the knowing the trust or being able to have trust in somebody in whom you have with whom you have no previous contact?
It's actually two different things. So the first is the degree to which that reputation layer enables Uber to scale. Right? So they are not bandwidth limited by the Dunbar capacity in the relationships of their humans in their company with the drivers. So Uber can have an unlimited number of drivers with a very small number of other human beings managing the process. Right? All that happens out in the reputation layer. That's really the number one. This enables a very different set of organizational structures. And then the second is that the movement then is this idea that and this is actually legacy, your relationship as a rider is with Uber as an overall brand, right, as a convivium. Your trust is in Uber, and you have very little consideration of the individual with whom you're riding. Now, of course, we had that happen already with the emergence of the yellow cab, right? But that's really just another great example of the idea of the translation of, in this case, a reputation currency, otherwise known as a brand, and it's used to completely change the dynamics of how we would otherwise behave, right? Without the presence of a brand that I trust to get into the car with an otherwise complete stranger and go somewhere, we wouldn't do it, right? So you can see how that would work.
Thanks for all those great ideas, Jordan. I'm more hopeful about the potential value of the reputation system on the customer side of Uber. I love talking to Uber drivers about this. You know, there's a lot of informal complicity, whereas somebody leaves the car, they say 5 for 5, and which is an agreement that can be inspected later, that I'll give you 5 stars if you give me 5 stars. But if you talk to Uber drivers in college towns, take Durham, Chapel Hill, you know, the riders who throw up in the ashtrays don't get a 4.9 average.
Right.
And things happen really fast. So there's probably some scarcity balance that would supply and demand balance that would explain when that reputation system gets called into play and then gets to have fidelity and have real signal and feedback.
Yeah, no question. I mean, it's sort of half joking. I think the total potential of rating the riders is obvious, and that's why Uber does it, right? They have the data, like nobody's business. The fact that they don't necessarily surface it for you when you're looking at your own rating, there's an infinite number of possible explanations for that. But absolutely, the ability to use a rider rating to create a meta evaluation of the quality of their own rating of drivers is one, and then to use a behavior rating to identify whether or not your ass gets put in the car or whether you get charged more because you're known to be a hassle, right? Which is another great one. I'm just going to work my way this way. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was fascinating. This might be an oversimplification, but one way to summarize what you said maybe is that the history of currency is a history of technology increasing bandwidth and enabling greater complexity. So the ledger, for example, was technology that did that. And now it's happening faster and faster with things like Uber. Do you think there's some kind of Moore's Law concept here?
I'm actually going to pull a Krakauer and say, first, that is, I think, an oversimplification. I think the history of currency is a really complex relationship between simplification and complexification. There's a move in both directions constantly. There's a real tension on when different systems select for simplification and complexification. Now, with regard to Moore's law, what I would say is that one way of thinking about what Moore's law represents is a world historic increase in bandwidth capacity, which then immediately changes the total set of the dynamics that we could expect to emerge in currency space. You know, if you're talking about a bandwidth capacity increase that is exponential, then the total set of currencies that can be effectively input, processed, and used to select behaviors is, you know, novel, right, in the world. And that would, by hypothesis, give rise to a completely new set of convivia, disruptively as well as constructively. Does that make sense? All the way in the back, the gentleman in the white shirt.
I'm going to borrow a microphone at the table.
Oh. The lady.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. That was fantastic. I was at a recent conference talking to a city manager. He's a manager of a very large city for Uber. And the idea came up of selling reputational scores to credit reporting agencies, which would then deliberately impact, I mean, it would become a currency. Just want to get your thoughts on that and other, I guess, manifestations of this, this score.
I actually included a slide on FICO in here originally, because that obviously is a currency that we've all begun to deal with that plays a slightly different role than tokenized currency, right? It's more contextualized. It's associated with you. I can't trade you my FICO score, but it's significantly used to organize and shape the way that we behave in the environment. I would say, without a doubt, there are going to be the emergence of a whole cluster of reputation currencies that have fidelity for a whole variety of different kinds of expected behaviors, and those will then replace FICO, which is a very rough-hewn concept, and change. And around them will emerge new sets of economic behaviors, and probably even new sets of social behaviors, right? Because the old school idea of being able to vouch for someone and share your reputation to allow them to have access to things they may not otherwise have access to is something that begins to emerge under novel bandwidth capacities. Right? So I could tag you with my virtual vouch, and then you could actually use my reputation portably, right? Not unportably, in your encounters with other people.
So on the topic of Uber's ratings for users, an interesting thought occurred to me, because I've also talked with a bunch of Uber drivers about how they rate their passengers, just out of curiosity. And I talked to one once who said that, I asked, so if someone throws up in your car, you're going to rate them really low, right? And they told me, no, I can't do that. They say, and I think he was referring to Uber, the company, they say that is illness. And people get sick, and so we can't rate them down for being sick, even though, of course, he knew that most people were throwing up in his car because they were utterly irresponsible drunks, or, you know, fun people. And what occurred to me is that's interesting, that by being the maintainer of that ledger of reputation, Uber has a lot of wiggle room to create policy. And we have to ask ourselves, what is Uber's ultimate incentive when they try and calibrate how that ledger actually functions? And their incentive is to gain users. Their incentive is to convince more venture capitalists to fund their company. Mm-hmm. And in order to that, you need network effects. You need to be the personal driver for everyone in the world, and you need to outcompete Lyft when it comes to gaining new passengers. You're generally less concerned with gaining drivers, because the drivers will go where the passengers are. So I don't mean to sound too conspiratorial here, but I am. I think what we possibly see here is a situation where we don't see the emergence of a robust tokenized reputation that Uber's developing for users, just one for drivers, because Uber's trying to weigh the scales of this ledger in order to gain some larger currency in the world as a brand. And then to build on that, what we haven't discussed so far in our discussion after your talk was what you suggested could happen next, wherein a blockchain disintermediates Uber, who disintermediated taxi services. Yep. And that would be really a truly peer-to-peer system, wherein you wouldn't be able necessarily, depending on how it was set up, able to weigh the scales in favor of some outcome of drivers versus passengers. We're all just people with good qualities and bad qualities.
Yeah, well, what I would generalize is that the idea that has significant currency in my world, and I don't know how much it has currency more broadly, is the degree to which we are now both empowered to and responsible for the deliberate design of our currency systems. Right? These things are not crafted out of whole cloth. They're not received from the divine. We make them. And in the case of Uber, it's sort of obvious that we make them. But in the case of our, our current monetary system, we make that too. And being able to actually think, okay, this is a designed system that has some degree of predictability, right, and maybe some significant degrees of unpredictability. How do we go about doing that deliberately to generate the results that we actually want to accomplish with certain degrees of expected outcomes and certain forms of resilience is very, very talked about within the blockchain community. It really deserves to be talked about more broadly in the framework of all forms of currency systems.
So can you talk more about that? I mean, in the case of Uber, it's still, I think the thing's on, isn't it? In the case of Uber, you do know that the driver, the rider has a credit card registered, right? So you know that person has a credit card. There's enough time to know if it's fraud for Uber to be able to tell if you're a real person with a real address and everything. Mm-hmm. And the same thing on the, on the driver's side, they went through a background check, and so there is this sense that it's tied back to these old infrastructures, which was to your last point, in that the trust is still based on a credit card on the passenger side,
yeah,
and the trillions of dollars in the banking industry worldwide, and then there's this sense of, you're not a felon on the, on the driver's side. So there is these traditional systems. The question I have is there any systems that aren't based on that?
Aren't based on legacy connections to legacy trust? Yeah,
aren't tied back to, some banking system, or to your point you were just talking about, they're tied back to these credit cards, which is the banking system. So I've got some sense that I'm not going to have a killer, driving with me. There is some faith. Is there any systems out there that aren't based on?
Well, I'm going to make a quick conceptual distinction. I'm going to define the Dunbar sensemaker as the platform. Right? So human beings' capacity to engage in socialization and trust whatsoever is the base platform. And then we're going to have a series of strata of platform on top of that. Right? Do you trust the Catholic Church? Do you trust the U.S. government? Do you trust U.S. dollars? Or do you trust credit cards, whatnot? Are these layers, right, that we've built kind of over time? And so if I separate those two, with regard to the latter, the short answer is yes. Right? Facebook, in principle, has a base on the Dunbar sensemaker level. But if I like you on Facebook, that has no preconceived relationship to, say, any other existing phenomenon in the economic landscape. I would venture the notion that Bitcoin is actually a very interesting example of the emergence of a new, completely separate trust layer. Now, obviously, it's highly coupled right now with the legacy financial system. Right? If you want to buy Bitcoin, generally speaking, you're going to be using some kind of other form of money. But I've got all my Bitcoin by mining them, and it's possible, and I've given them to people in exchange for direct relationships. So it exists at least uncoupled, if not completely decoupled.
But the Facebook
that was the point. That was the point I wanted to make, is that in Bitcoin, the underlying trust is to cryptography and not to any of the legacy systems. So there's a separation, but when you use Bitcoins, then you may be engaged in some of the same kind of trust levels.
Yep.
But the actual Bitcoin and its inherent worth is independent of those prior trust systems.
Right, exactly. And that's a very interesting novel innovation in the space, is the ability to trust cryptography, which of course is trusting math, or to a different math plus cryptographers. And that's a very different vibe, and they have a different set of environments.
Well, thank you for your inside talk. I'm here with a couple of friends from Europe, actually from the Netherlands. And I just had a discussion with the European Commission, who are very concerned about the proliferation of platforms. You mentioned Uber, you have Airbnb, you mentioned Facebook. And it looks like we're becoming kind of scattered over the cyberspace, because everywhere I drop my information, people say I'm involved in different types of transactions. And it looks like that for every single type of transaction, we need a separate platform. And now people are looking at, can we not create a kind of overarching platform where you can do transactions with anyone and any kind of transactions, which is based on a new protocol, which is called UETP, Uniform Economic Transaction Protocol. And my question to you is, do you believe that such a thing is possible? And also, and I know there's a difference also between Europe and America about privacy issues. So we believe that it could be good to have a kind of overarching platform which is based on trust, and where we don't have all these platforms where we don't know what people are doing with our information. And so we believe that this is, you already talked about disrupting the disruptors. So I was wondering, do you believe that such a disrupting thing can happen?
You have no idea the depths of disruption that I conspire to. I'll take it actually as a sign of the simple fact of the local currency that I'm here and not there that you're asking me that question. I'm not sure that I have any specific expertise. But honestly, I think it's flat out unknown. Right? What we're dealing with is the bandwidth capacity of different kinds of institutional structures to navigate the significant complexity that we're talking about, both in terms of absolute complexity in time, in space, right? The total number of velocity and the velocity of change, right? My personal experience is that institutions constructed prior to the 21st century generally lack the bandwidth capacity to successfully endure the complexity of the evolving information space. Right? So that'd be my basic heuristic. I wouldn't ask a 50s institution to do a 21st century job. It's just not likely to be successful. Now, is it more broadly possible to design systems that are able to ameliorate some of the significant disadvantages of different kinds of platforms, not just the multiplicity of platforms, but also their power structures? Right? As we mentioned, oh, by the way, just caveat, I'm a seed investor in Uber. Right? So I have a stake in that, an unusually large stake given the huge valuation they've gotten. But giving Travis the unfettered authority over this new platform is a separate issue than just giving it to, say, a blockchain-mediated company. Right? So there's a number of different variables. Can we design a system that optimizes for a number of the different values that we want to actually optimize for and ameliorates a lot of the risks? Absolutely. There's no question. We do a terribly shitty job of it right now. So doing less shitty is well within our scope. But I think we can actually do quite well. I think that an honest understanding of what the real dynamics are of what's going on without being coupled to preconceived notions of what we can do or how we should do it is all it really takes. Like, we actually know a lot about what we need to do. It's mostly ourselves holding ourselves back because we don't think in a transdisciplinary way, in my opinion. Uh-oh, Megan.
So I want to step back just for a second and talk about the one currency we all seem to be stuck with, this whole federal currency. And I really appreciate your point that what currency allows us to do is to take exchange and feedback to scale. But I think what I also heard was that we lose a lot of the variety of that feedback that we might have experienced at a Dunbar level, and that we can see short-term return on capital, but we cease being able to see any of these other variables, whether it's environmental externality or happiness or community or all sorts of other things that our driving currency system doesn't recognize outside of the signals that it gets about, will this increase our capital or not?
Yeah.
So do you have thoughts on how we introduce multivariable feedback, not just within a platform like Uber, but within a broad currency structure?
Yeah, that's fundamental. So first, you reminded me, I need to send out a love note to Jeffrey West. The founder of Backfeed asked me specifically to say that he's a fanboy and he thinks your stuff is awesome. String theorist, who then became a blockchain software developer and is now an entrepreneur building decentralized companies. So you can imagine why he would connect. The reason why that comes to my mind is that when contemplating this question of the risks of fetishization, which is associated with simplification, right? The more you simplify a currency, the more you decontextualize it, the more likely it is to be amenable to fetishization, which means to say inappropriate optimization. And it's an interesting risk, right? The inappropriate optimization of specific signals gives a short-term benefit. You are going to get more of whatever it is you're optimizing for. But by clipping away the complexity, clipping away the contextualization, you're not getting what you think you're getting, right? And that's what leads to things like hypertrophication. And I think that's actually very, very closely linked to the stuff that Jeffrey and Luis found in terms of the amelioration of innovation in scaling firms, right? At a certain point, they get to a complexity level that they begin to try to optimize for simple currencies, which gives them a short-term boost in measurable productivity, but at the cost of decontextualizing what actually generated the real signal and value in their convivium, and that then is what turns them into non-generative phenomena. So the hope, right, at this point it's really just a hope, is that we can in fact design new forms of bandwidth capacity. And I know you have real challenges with that, and they're very legitimate, but new forms of bandwidth capacity that are able to actually deal with high complexity, the real, the stuff the Dunbar SenseMaker can handle at a high modality, and possibly even new kinds of technology that can actually use things like our skin response and our gut response and the way that our pupils dilate to actually modulate our behavior in the environment, not just a keyboard and a screen. I'm talking about serious tech that will enable us to basically make trust in the old sense, right, actual human relationship trust, scalable. Right? That's the big gamut. If we can figure out a way to actually lift highly contextual, real rich human relationship stuff, like the maximum that we have capacity for at the Dunbar level, and simulate enough of that to make it really scalable, that would be the answer to the problem. And I don't know if we could do that, but I hope we can, and I suspect it's within the scope of doability within sort of the next 2 decades.
So, Jordan, I think we can be really careful about how we think about the coupling of Bitcoin and other currencies, particularly thinking about decoupling, because
keep talking to the
Mike.
Class old folk, please use the
Okay. Can you hear me now? All right. So Bitcoin evolved in the context of well-established currencies, right? And so any question about its decoupling, I think, really needs to first consider the possibility or the counterfactual question, which is, could it have evolved as quickly as it has, and would it be sustainable in the absence of those legacy currencies, right? So the coupling question is kind of complicated.
Yeah, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to thank you for delivering one of your currencies into this convivium, which is rigor. Right? One of the things I've actually quite admired about you in the past is you have an unusually high capacity for being careful and being rigorous, and I suck at it, so it's great that you brought that up. And you're absolutely right. That's a very good question, and I think that I have no idea. It's a very good question. I have absolutely no idea. And by extension, by the way, I also have no idea what the variance of the sort of the paths would be taken under varied specific local currency systems. Right? It's one of the characteristics. I was involved in Bitcoin way back in the very earliest days. I do not know who Satoshi is, but beyond that. And if you look at the anthropology of Bitcoin, which frankly I think is more important and more interesting than the technology of Bitcoin, the early adopters of Bitcoin were allergic to trust, right, at a deep level. Right? These are human beings who have a really hard time trusting other people at a Dunbar level. Right? And that's unbelievably important in understanding its actual real evolution in space, and expanded in a series of concentric circles as the capacity and the technology enabled other people to see different use cases that attracted them. But one of the earliest attractors was, in fact, people who radically did not trust the government, other people, existing currencies, et cetera, right? And so there's a deep implication, actually, that there's something about what Megan pointed out, right? The decontextualization of the contemporary environment and the amelioration of actual human trust, which is part of the feedstock that gave rise to Bitcoin and allowed it to at least get to critical mass. Now, once you get past that portal pathway, though, right? Once you're exploring language space, shit's going, right? So we're on the other side of that pathway, but it's an interesting question. Am I out of time? I feel like I am.
No, you can take questions.
All right, call me David. Just yank me bring out the hook.
Just a real quick add-on to that. I'm sorry, I don't know your name? Jessica. One thing that occurs to me is, it's interesting, Jordan and I have never met and we haven't coordinated before, but I'm going to give a presentation that was originally scheduled to go now that would actually very well synergize and feed into what you're saying. But instead of the term fetishization, which I actually very much like, and I think it's a great way of looking at this problem when the signal becomes when we focus on the signal as opposed to what the signal's, the information that it's supposed to be conveying. Instead of fetishization, in my presentation I used the term monoculture, which is not one-to-one. It's a different problem, but this idea that we become over-obsessed with one particular signal. We become over-obsessed with Federal Reserve notes. And so my answer to you would be that yes, there is a problem with Bitcoin being coupled to the Federal Reserve System or to world currencies. However, maybe what Bitcoin is doing is not so much presenting an alternative that will have a full substitution effect that we can then fetishize over instead, but rather just diversity and the avoidance of the dangers of monoculture. And I'm particularly, and you know, this fad almost came and went already with the cryptocurrency space, of altcoins, of multiple different types of cryptocurrencies, because these things are just software and they can be forked and they can be changed, and the basis and the value of them can be set to whatever somebody wants them to be. And I think that diversity is perhaps what we can better hope for rather than just a new substitute for the Federal Reserve note.
Well, I mean, if we're going to go there, I routinely abuse the concept of fitness landscape, and because David mentioned it to me at one point, and I stole it and just started using it to explain anything I wanted to. What I would ask is sort of what is the fitness landscape in which these particular things are evolving, right? The emergence of altcoins is based upon the fact that the fitness landscape of cryptocurrencies allows any reasonably effective software developer to experiment, but the demand side and the total side of utility leads to them not having a whole lot of utility value, so they don't get uptake, right? So there's a set of components that enter into this fitness landscape that describe what the proliferation of altcoins look like, right? So we've got a fitness landscape constraint. Now the question is, how good are we at defining and designing fitness landscapes? And can we say anything intelligent about what we ought to do to design fitness landscapes? Right? That's where I find sort of applied complexity, boom, I said it, is incredibly useful. Right? Some of the things that we could think about is, to what degree can we actually make ethical statements or strategic statements about what kinds of fitness landscapes are, in fact, the kinds we'd like to have, certain degrees of diversity and a natural attraction to certain resilience to monoculture. And then, of course, to what degree can we actually deliver on that as a maintaining species? All the way right there, yes, you.
So the question I have is, one system I'm thinking about is a case study where the trust exists and there isn't really much of a debasement and the signal is there, is open source system like Wikipedia, where, and again, I'm not necessarily going to be able to relate it to all the very interesting concepts being discussed here. They're a little above my intelligence level here, right here, but the idea that there is a very real currency in the form of information that lots of people are contributing and evolving. There are some moderators also who don't really have a reputational currency for themselves, but just in the currency of the information. And yet the development of the intelligence that, or the information at least, that sort of comes out of it is still focused on the unit of measurement itself. So the debasement of information is not occurring, even though this thing is operating without a lot of the legacy systems and units of measurement or legacy trust. So but I guess what I'm offering is the Wikipedia may be a case study of a system of currency that somehow overcomes a lot of the drawbacks that we're discussing about these other systems.
I am only somewhat familiar with the anthropology of Wikipedia, enough to be dangerous, and I'm going to say things that are okay. There are people who actually know that well, and a deep dive on the anthropology of Wikipedia would be incredibly useful. What I would say is that when you're operating with Wikipedia, you're dealing with a number of different coupled convivia. Right? So there are relationships between the editors and actually subtribes within the editor environment in Wikipedia who are themselves operating with different kinds of currencies. People make edits, people communicate on the back end of the editorial board, people engage in real meetups that play an enormous role actually in the evolution of Wikipedia. Right now, I believe I can't remember what the name of the group is, but it's the the compactness party, effectively, who wants Wikipedia to be the minimum necessary set of entries and deletes, actively trims the tree and prunes it to inhibit the emergence. For example, I'm not on Wikipedia because I'm not important enough, right? The other group is the exhaustiveness, right? Their point of view is that information is cheap, so we should have all information that is in fact true should be in Wikipedia. And that's an interesting evolution that's happening on the set of currencies that are available within the boundaries of Wikipedia itself. And when I say set of currencies, what I mean is that the affordances made available by the underlying technology, right? The fact that I have an identity that makes edits, the edits that I make can be traced, there are ways for me to actually leave comments for different people. That's the sort of the bandwidth capacity of what this particular set of agents can do, and that creates the fitness landscape that then gives rise to a certain set of convivia that relate to each other in a certain way, right? Now, at the higher order, you then have the relationship of the rest of us, right, parasites, on the good work of the Wikipedia content creators, which is based on a different set of currencies. In this case, it's the currency of high-fidelity information, right? That's the signal. The signal that has meaning is that when I read Wikipedia, I get something which is true. And by the way, also quick, easy, fast, up-to-date, et cetera, right? So something about that is what gives it currency. And then there we know, here, actually, there's been very complex maneuvers around the debasement of that currency, right? I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was a big a moment, what was it, 7 years ago? When it was noticed that there were en masse batch edits being made by particular entities for obvious reasons, right, to debase the currency, to signal jack in this case, right, to take advantage of the signal of, oh, I trust Wikipedia, and therefore I'll believe that Stephen Colbert invented the camel, for example, if you remember that facade. And that required the innovation of a new set of technologies that was able to monitor and inhibit that, right? So that was actually a really interesting back and forth in that environment of a change in the fitness landscape that inhibited certain kinds of behaviors that were in fact specifically trying to take advantage and debase. In the present environment, I know for a fact that that particular set of technical architectures has been circumvented and that some large entities, specifically Big Pharma, I just happen to know that because I've done research on it, has in fact signal jacked Wikipedia pretty significantly. So I wouldn't place a lot of trust in the stories on Wikipedia around pharmaceuticals. They have been shaped in sort of an Uber fashion to a benefit that is not coherent to the maintenance of the convivium that Wikipedia is. Okay. Oh.
I think your idea about signal jacking and debasement is very interesting. I never really thought about it in that way. But my question is, do you think that maybe debasement is just a universal feature of all currencies? Because you can talk about the Fed and fiat money, or you can talk about people living their life on Facebook that they wish to see other people leading rather than their actual life, which may feed into the way that companies like Cabbage, which are trying to create a new type of credit score around your social media presence, you know, you can obviously game that.
Yep.
You mentioned Uber being able to, well, we don't know, but perhaps having different kinds of motivations for managing what kind of information you're able to see about your own ranking as a user. And then even in the realm of Bitcoin, we've had failures of Mt. Gox due to theft. You know, it's subject to that sort of very crude, just outright theft level of debasement.
Yeah, so
do you think it's a universal property of all currencies?
The way I would say it is that it's a universal niche of all currencies. And then the degree to which that niche is populated and the size of the niche is what matters. Right? So for example, in the case of Monopoly, if there's one banker and that banker is operating behind a black shield that none of us can monitor, the niche is large, and one would expect that it gets populated pretty quickly, which is to say that currency is ripe for debasement, and then we lose currency. If we modulate or we change the environment by creating various kinds of checks and balances, take away the shield so we can all see what the banker's doing, then the niche is changed, right? And so it's actually selecting for a different kind of in this case, parasite. So we'd actually say that the abstract concept of different forms of parasitism and different forms of predation clearly exist in the abstract ecosystems that we're talking about. So the question is not if, but kind of how, and more importantly, how much.
Fascinating talk, thanks. Thank you. One interpretation of the world you describe is that until recent history, money issued by governments was the one currency that could scale. But technology and these other trends you've described now have democratized scaling of currency, that all kinds of currencies can scale even to a global level and very quickly. So if we're heading to a world of many, many currencies, decentralized, many in the private sector, many, not even having a center, completely autonomous as you describe it. Question A, does fiat money by governments just kind of become, one of the animals on the evolutionary landscape and may not survive? And B, how do we, in that world, continue to protect democratic accountability and individual rights and introduce an ethical dimension in this very kind of decentralized, chaotic currency world?
Man, this is a great conversation. So let's see. So in the first, what I would say is that the function space, right, the toolkit of fiat currency issued by governments does not, but that the relative monopoly of the overall currency space that occupies right now is absolutely going to shrink tremendously. And I would add, simply empirically, that the debasement of those fiat currencies that we've seen over the past decade and a half is part and parcel, right? So you've got one, that their jungle is turning into a relative desert, but also they've been profligate with just disposing of their water. So those two forces are happening simultaneously. So what I would expect to see is a selection, an extinction event of fiat currencies in the sort of relative term, and then the reemergence of new uses of that toolkit in a new environment. Right? That would be something I'd say at some level of predictability. Now, the second question, actually, would you mind asking it again? Because it was deep, it was hard.
In this new world, how do we maintain notions of democratic accountability, individual rights, and ethics? So if somehow, my currency on, pick your platform is abused in some way, who do I go to get it fixed? Where's redress? Where's accountability? Who's setting the rules for these systems? How does that work?
All right, so I think first order, as a general heuristic, tools and techniques that were built in the 20th century should be looked at with significant skepticism. Right? So the feedback loops that were designed to inhibit various forms of predation and signal jacking in the past are appropriate for the time and place that they were built in, but are in fact likely to be not useful now, right? Because the predators and the parasites have evolved various sort of defense mechanisms against them, and the fitness landscape has changed. So that's a first order heuristic, right? So if we respond to that question by saying that we should develop a bureaucracy that engages in some kind of citizen reputation, I suspect that's not going to work, right? It's sort of just a general rule of thumb. Now, flips on the other side, I think the heuristic that I would operate in sort of the positive direction is to say, okay, well let's look at what are the forces from the future that seem to be emergent now, right? And here I'm kind of taking from the arc in economics that sort of Brian Arthur back, right? The notion that there are sort of disruptive S-curves that seem to build and grow and then normalize and then replace themselves, right? So imagine that, and by the way, I think that those S-curves are generalizable, but that's the notion. So the 20th century institutional order is one S-curve that has a whole set of adaptive responses to the generalizable problems of debasement and things like that. And that our present moment is a conjunction of the past and the future, right? There's a future S-curve, say Google, for example, or the blockchain, that represents some other set of deep dynamics that are responsive to a very different set of capacities that manifest in the present based upon how those things can, in fact, actually get traction and build in the present. But if you imagine the system evolving over time, you could expect that they would continue to grow. So that's what I mean. From the future is that something is, you see it now, but that it clearly is associated with a set of forces that we actually could expect to have more and more influence over time. And from the past are forces that we'd expect their influence to decline over time. Right? So given that set of heuristics, what I would then do is I would look at the sort of things like decentralization and trustless and cryptography. Right? And decentralization is actually a reasonably well understood technique now. And in fact, this is a good institution for actually talking about it in general. And if you want to do decentralization well, there are a number of things that you need to do. Right? You have to have capacity for the toolkit, the whole sort of suite of functions. It needs to be pushed to the edge. Right? So centralizing functional capacity is inhibitory to decentralized environments. I need to actually have the edge. It needs to be fully empowered. And I don't know if that makes sense, but we can sort of unpack it later.
Yeah, you mentioned an extinction event of fiat currencies. But getting to Jessica's question earlier, there's still a coupling that needs to be solved at some point to these new currencies. And then when you have a proliferation of all these new currencies, you're going to have an extinction event there, too. So yeah. I think a lot of people would hear this and just get freaked out. so that you drain a lot of trust from the system, and if you bring down the legacy fiat that's still coupled, and then you have a huge extinction event of the new stuff, people are going to be like, wait, what am I left with? What do I trust here?
Yeah, great.
So it's like this huge sort of debasement risks that I think are going to freak a lot of people out.
So what I'm going to take from that is actually to remind me, so this notion of pushing the whole toolkit to the edge, this particular extinction event is one. Right? There's lots and lots. Right? If we're dealing with something that's going to be breaking down the 20th century institutional order broadly, freaking out is the least of what's going to happen, right? So one might imagine that a big part of the necessary components is a high degree of resilience and a capacity to act effectively during highly complex environments at the individual level, right? So one of the things that I would advocate is, as individuals, get really good with dealing with being freaked out. And I don't mean that just sort of episodically. It's not like we're going to have a single crisis, but in fact, if we're right about the nature of this new world, it is in fact one that's very different from the way that human beings evolved, right? The rate of change that we'll be dealing with seems to be a fundamental. And it's not like things are going to slow down again and we'll be back to a nice bucolic agrarian society where it takes several hundred years for shit to change, right? So being freaked out is going to be part of the human condition, and empowering people with various techniques, technological, behavioral, et cetera, relationships, cohorts, groups. I mean, there's a whole bunch of technologies. And this is what I'm talking about. We're actually talking about having to build stuff at a base level. If we're working up here at the higher level of the superstructure, we don't know how to do that yet. But there are things we can actually say intelligently at the base level that gives rise to it, then comes up, right? So the way I think about it is we have to get a whole lot smarter. That's the bottom line. And the way we get a whole lot smarter is we have to figure out how collective intelligence works, and then we have to implement it, which means things like learning how to trust each other, learning how to communicate effectively, learning how to control our own emotional responses to other people's dialogue so we can actually stay in a state of dialogue and a state of argument, identify what individuals in the total universe we should be communicating with, how we should be communicating with them, that kind of stuff. If we can get a whole lot smarter, then the actual solutions will emerge from that. That's a really good way of answering your question.
Can I, Walter, let Walter ask a question, and then let's do the experiment of having a conversation with your table and get to know each other a little bit. The problem with all of these meetings is you hear the speaker, but you don't necessarily hear each other.
Yeah.
And so if that doesn't work, we won't do it after this session. But let's have Walter give one more question, and then we'll do that.
Well, the more this terrific discussion progressed, the more your slide here acquired an apocalyptic feel to me. So I'm not sure I can ask a new question, given what the great questions have been asked before. But you started out with your hydrogen atom, which was signal, sense, and feedback. And as you progressed, that model seemed to disintegrate somehow because the sense maker and the feedback, there seems to be no longer a sharp boundary between the sense maker and the feedback. And if that boundary is disintermediated, as it were, then the whole system in a way sort of becomes not just autonomous, but also completely decoupled and hallucinatory in some sense. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I would recommend the science fiction books called The Golden Transcendence. The sci-fi guys are the only ones who seriously consider what you're talking about, and it's worth seriously considering. So yes, it is entirely possible that that's actually what ends up happening over, say, a century or a 2-century time frame, and it's a meaningful problem. So people who like to think millennium in advance, I would seriously focus on it.
Could you restate the problem?
The problem is that at a certain point, the feedback loop, the boundary between the sense maker and the feedback loop begins to become dissolved. And what ends up happening is that the capacity of the sense maker to modify its own environment becomes so significant that you essentially enter into a hallucinatory terrain. We might call this the post-singularity problem for people who kind of like to think that way. Although if you do that, you're almost certainly narrowing your capacity to think about it. But it's a good sort of, don't fetishize that concept, but use it as a flag. Uh-oh, Jeffrey's going to exercise his emeritus authority.
Do you want to exercise your emeritus authority?
No, not particularly, but I did want to make a comment that is relevant. I wasn't going to make it, but then you brought up this somewhat flaky word, sense maker, and I wanted to referring to Dunbar. So I wanted to just clarify that a little bit because it's relevant to questions of understanding what the dynamic is here and getting some ideas about how this may evolve into the future. And so that takes us back to trying to get a science of this. Is there some science underlying all this? And you hinted at it, of course, by bringing up Robin Dunbar's work. And I want to, because I don't think most people are not very familiar with that, I just wanted to make a comment about it. And that is that you referred to the Dunbar number, roughly 150, which is sort of the number of people that you can sort of keep contact with in some reasonable way. But there isn't a Dunbar number, there's a sequence of Dunbar numbers. And that plays into this previous piece of the conversation, because the first Dunbar number is 5, which is the people you love and hate passionately. So that's typically your family. But it could be, but it's an evolving number, obviously, involving a group, but that number is 5. And then very roughly speaking, the hierarchy goes up by factors of 3. And at the same time, the connectivity, the currency flow in this language, decreases. So it's kind of like a fractal hierarchy. So the next number is 15. And the next number is roughly 50. 45, 50. That's the Santa Fe Institute. That's why the Santa Fe Institute is roughly of the order of 50, because we can still know each other, interact, and our love and hate is decreased a little bit, but we still, we know each other. And then the next one is about 150, which is the one that you have referred to, but that's just one of a sequence, because the next one is 500, and the last one is 1500 before it completely dissipates. So if you're going to speculate in a science fiction way about what the future will look like, you could speculate that if you increase the currency of interaction in some way, that number of 150 could conceivably end up being 500, or it could decrease to 50. It could be. So I think we shouldn't fixate so much on this sense maker as sort of a fixed quantity, but recognize that, especially since we're changing currencies, that conceivably, at a socioeconomic level, this system could evolve into something that could accommodate much more. Or it could invert and accommodate much less and contract.
David, so what Jeffrey pointed out, I just want to make clear. The concept of sense maker I'm using to define includes a wide variety of phenomena. A camera is a sense maker in this definition. The Dunbar sense maker is what I'm using to define the Homo sapiens sapiens, and Jeffrey just wonderfully expanded the scope and the dynamics of what that concept looks like. And then there's separate from the content of the sense maker is the agency of the sense maker, which is obviously a relationship between the sense maker and its environment. So 3 different concepts that have different capacities. All right?
Thank you very much, Jordan.